April 1944. Berlin. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland stands before the German Air Ministry, holding a report that no one wants to read. Between January and April 1944, the Luftwaffe's daytime fighter force has lost over 1,000 pilots. Not wounded, not captured, killed. Among them are squadron commanders, Gruppe leaders, Geschwader commanders, men with 50, 60, 70 aerial victories. Men who cannot be replaced because the training that created them no longer exists. Galland knows many of these names personally. Now he must explain why Germany's fighter arm is, in his own words, in sight of collapse. The answer is not complicated. It is mathematical. And mathematics does not negotiate with generals. Adolf Galland was not a typical general. At 32 years old, he held the rank of General Lieutenant, making him the youngest general officer in the entire German military. He had achieved 104 confirmed aerial victories, all of them against Western Allied aircraft. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds around his neck, one of only 27 men in German history to receive this decoration. Since November 1941, he had served as General der Jagdflieger, commander of all Luftwaffe fighter forces. His reputation preceded him everywhere. The slicked-back black hair, the thin mustache, the ever-present cigar clamped between his teeth, even in the cockpit, the Mickey Mouse emblem painted on his aircraft, an irreverent touch that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. Galland looked like a fighter pilot from a propaganda film because in many ways he had helped create the image. But unlike other generals who spent their days in conference rooms studying maps, Galland refused to stay on the ground. Despite explicit orders from the High Command forbidding him from flying combat missions, he continued to take to the skies. Unauthorized sorties, secret flights. He needed to understand what was happening to his pilots. He needed to feel what they felt. And by early 1944, what was happening in the sky above Germany had begun to terrify him. In the spring of that year, Galland climbed into the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190 and took off to intercept an American bomber formation near the city of Magdeburg in central Germany. He found a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, massive four-engine bombers bristling with defensive guns, and he attacked. Within seconds, 4 P-51 Mustangs were on his tail. Galland was experienced enough to know that attempting a dogfight against 4 enemy fighters was suicide. The P-51 was fast, maneuverable, and flown by pilots who had been specifically trained to destroy men like him. So he did the only thing he could do. He dove. The Mustangs followed. Their tracer shells streaked past his canopy, close enough that he could see the individual rounds burning through the air. He was Germany's most decorated living ace, the commander of an entire air force, and he was running for his life from 4 American pilots whose names he would never know. He survived only through a trick he had used before. He fired his own machine guns while diving, creating streams of smoke that trailed behind his aircraft. The American pilots, seeing what appeared to be rear-firing weapons, broke off their pursuit. They had been trained not to take unnecessary risks. Galland escaped. But as he flew back to base, hands still trembling on the controls, he understood exactly what had just happened. The Americans had not hesitated. They had not been intimidated by his skill, or his reputation, or his decorations. They had attacked with numerical superiority, and they had pressed that advantage without mercy or hesitation. 4 against 1, and they had nearly won. This was the new reality of the air war over Germany, and Galland knew it was getting worse with every passing week. For Galland, the crisis that was consuming his fighter force had a precise starting point. It began in the last week of February 1944. The Americans called it Operation Argument. History would remember it as Big Week. From February 20th to February 25th, over 3,000 American heavy bombers, escorted by more than 1,000 fighters, attacked German aircraft factories across the Reich. The targets were carefully selected: Messerschmitt plants, Focke-Wulf assembly lines, ball-bearing factories, engine production facilities. Everything the Luftwaffe needed to keep fighting. Day after day the bombers came, wave after wave. The formations stretched across the sky for miles, hundreds of aircraft flying in precise defensive boxes, their contrails painting white lines across the German homeland. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. They had no choice. The factories being destroyed were producing the very aircraft they needed to survive. Every Messerschmitt 109 that rolled off an assembly line represented another chance to shoot down a bomber. Every factory that burned meant fewer fighters in the months ahead. German pilots attacked with everything they had. Single-engine fighters dove through the bomber formations, guns blazing. Twin-engine destroyers fired rockets into the massed bombers. The sky over Germany became a killing ground. In 6 days of continuous combat, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 350 fighter aircraft, 1/3 of all available fighters, destroyed in less than a week. But aircraft could be replaced. German factories, even damaged ones, could still produce new fighters. The catastrophe that Galland saw unfolding was something far worse than the loss of machines. In those 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost 17% of its fighter pilots. Galland understood immediately what this meant. A destroyed Messerschmitt could be replaced in 3 or 4 weeks. A new aircraft could roll off an assembly line and be delivered to a frontline unit within a month. But a pilot with 2 years of flight training, a pilot with hundreds of hours of combat experience, a pilot who had learned through trial and error how to survive against American fighters, that pilot could not be replaced. Not in a month, not in a year, perhaps not ever. And the losses continued after Big Week ended. March was worse. April was worse still. What made the situation even more desperate for Galland was the change in American tactics. Before 1944, American escort fighters had stayed close to their bomber formations. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings flew protective patterns around the B-17 and B-24, engaging German fighters only when they approached the bombers. The escorts were defensive. Their job was protection, not attack. But in early 1944, everything changed. General James Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, issued orders that transformed the air war. American fighters were no longer restricted to close escort. They were free to hunt. They could range ahead of the bomber streams, seeking out German fighters before they could form up for attacks. They could pursue retreating Germans back to their airfields. They could strafe aircraft on the ground, destroy them during takeoff, kill pilots before they ever reached altitude. The P-51 Mustang made this possible. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and internal fuel capacity augmented by drop tanks, the Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back. It could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. And it could fight any German aircraft on equal or superior terms. For Galland, the results were catastrophic. Wherever our fighters appeared, he later wrote, the Americans hurled themselves at them. They went over to low-level attacks on our airfields. Nowhere were we safe. We had to skulk on our own bases. During takeoff, during assembly, during climbing, during approach to the bombers, during combat, during return, during landing, and even after landing, the American fighters attacked with overwhelming superiority. The ratio of forces had become impossible. American fighters outnumbered German defenders by 6-1, sometimes 8-1. And the quality of American pilot training, Galland noted with professional respect, was astonishingly high. These were not amateurs. These were professionals. And they had more aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, and more pilots than Galland could ever hope to match. For Galland, understanding the full scope of the American advantage required looking far beyond the battlefield. The problem was not just numbers of aircraft or quality of tactics. The problem went deeper. It went all the way back to training. In 1944, the United States trained 29,000 new military pilots. Each of these pilots received approximately 200 hours of flight time before being assigned to a combat unit. They practiced instrument flying, formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and combat maneuvering. They used link trainers, mechanical flight simulators, that allowed them to build skills without risking aircraft or lives. They had unlimited fuel for training flights, unlimited aircraft, unlimited time. When an American pilot arrived at his unit in England or Italy, he was ready, not experienced perhaps, but competent. He knew how to fly his aircraft. He knew how to fight. He could survive long enough to learn the rest. Germany had none of these advantages. By 1944, Luftwaffe flight training had been slashed repeatedly. Fuel shortages meant fewer training hours. Aircraft shortages meant fewer training flights. Instructor shortages meant less individual attention. The pilots arriving at Galland's frontline units in early 1944 had sometimes less than 80 hours of total flight time. Some had never fired their guns at a moving target. Some had never practiced combat maneuvers against an experienced opponent. Galland watched these replacement pilots arrive at their squadrons, young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, eager, convinced that they would become aces like the men whose names they had heard celebrated on German radio, convinced that courage and determination would be enough. Most of them were dead within 30 days. The mathematics were brutal. An experienced pilot who survived his first 10 combat missions had a reasonable chance of surviving the war. His skills improved with each flight. He learned the tricks that kept men alive. He developed the instincts that separated the quick from the dead. But a pilot who arrived at his unit with inadequate training rarely survived long enough to gain experience. He made mistakes that veterans would never make. He flew into situations that veterans would have avoided. He died before he ever had a chance to become good. Galland called these young men cannon fodder. He did not mean it as an insult. He meant it as a statement of mathematical fact. While Galland struggled to keep his pilots alive, America's industrial machine operated at a scale that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run factory in Michigan, B-24 Liberator bombers rolled off the production line at the rate of 1 aircraft per hour. One complete 4-engine heavy bomber, with turrets and bomb bays and instruments and defensive armor, finished and ready for delivery, every 60 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When a B-24 was shot down over Germany, another one was already being built to replace it. When the crew of 10 men was killed or captured, another crew was completing their training at bases scattered across the American South and West. The system never stopped. The system never slowed. The system simply produced. Galland's American counterparts did not face the problems he faced. They did not have to calculate whether launching an attack today would leave them defenseless tomorrow. They did not have to choose which targets to protect, because they lacked the aircraft to protect them all. They did not have to watch irreplaceable veterans die while knowing that the replacements would be inadequate. The Americans could absorb losses that would have destroyed the Luftwaffe twice over. They could lose 100 bombers in a single raid and launch another raid the next day with even more aircraft. They could trade casualties at ratios that seemed suicidal and still come out ahead. Each incursion of the enemy, Galland reported to the Air Ministry in the spring of 1944, is costing us some 50 aircrew. 50 pilots per raid. Some raids came 3 times per week. 150 pilots per week. 600 pilots per month. The arithmetic was catastrophic. German factories were still producing fighters. In fact, thanks to dispersal programs and underground production facilities, German fighter output was actually increasing in 1944. But production was meaningless without pilots to fly the aircraft. Fuel was becoming increasingly scarce as Allied bombers targeted refineries and synthetic oil plants. Spare parts were harder to find. The entire infrastructure that supported the Luftwaffe was collapsing from multiple directions simultaneously. Galland could see the end approaching. He could calculate exactly when his fighter force would cease to exist as an effective fighting unit. In April 1944, Adolf Galland delivered his assessment to the German High Command. The report was detailed, precise, and devastating. Between January and April, the Luftwaffe's daytime fighter force had lost over 1,000 pilots killed in action. Among the dead were the most experienced squadron commanders, Gruppe leaders, and Geschwader commanders in the service. Men with decades of combined experience. Men who had written the tactics that German pilots used. Men whose knowledge died with them. The quality of replacement pilots was dangerously inadequate. The ratio of forces continued to deteriorate. The enemy showed no signs of reducing the intensity of their attacks. The trajectory of the air war pointed toward only one outcome. "The time has come," Galland wrote, "when our weapon is in sight of collapse." He proposed solutions, desperate solutions, but solutions nonetheless. He wanted to assemble a massive reserve force of fighters, perhaps 2,000 or more, and hold them back from daily combat. When conditions were right, this force would be unleashed in a single massive attack against an American bomber formation. If they could destroy 400 or 500 bombers in a single day, perhaps the Americans would be forced to pause their offensive. Perhaps there would be time to rebuild. Galland called this plan the Big Blow. He believed it was Germany's last chance to regain some measure of control over its own skies. His superiors listened to his proposal. They examined his numbers. They discussed his plan in meetings that stretched for hours, and then they did nothing. The fighters Galland wanted were never assembled. The fuel reserves he needed were never allocated. The training programs he demanded were never implemented. The High Command had other priorities. They were planning offensives that required air support. They were defending against threats on multiple fronts. They could not spare 2,000 fighters for a single gamble, no matter how promising that gamble might be. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, responded to Galland's reports with accusations rather than solutions. He blamed the fighter pilots for cowardice. He accused them of abandoning their duty. He demanded impossible results with impossible resources and then expressed outrage when those results failed to materialize. Galland continued to fight. He continued to fly his unauthorized missions. He continued to watch his men die in numbers that grew larger every month. He knew the war was lost, not because German pilots lacked courage, not because German engineers lacked brilliance, not because German factories lacked productivity. The war was lost because courage and brilliance and productivity cannot defeat a system that produces bombers faster than you can shoot them down and trains pilots faster than you can kill them. The air war over Europe was not being decided by individual aces performing heroic feats. It was being decided by factories in Michigan and training bases in Texas. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely contest the skies over France. German pilots who rose to attack the invasion forces faced immediate interception by swarms of American and British fighters. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, Spitfires, and Typhoons patrolled the skies in such numbers that any German aircraft spotted was almost immediately engaged by multiple enemies. Those German pilots who somehow reached the beaches found themselves attacking under fire, unable to aim properly, unable to make multiple passes, unable to accomplish anything meaningful before being driven off or shot down. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 300 sorties on D-Day. The Allies flew over 14,000. Air superiority belonged to the Allies. It would never return to German hands. Adolf Galland survived the war. In January 1945, he was finally removed from his position as General der Jagdflieger after years of conflict with Göring and the High Command. But instead of being sidelined completely, he was given command of Jagdverband 44, an elite unit equipped with Me-262 jet fighters. He continued flying combat until April 26, 1945, when his jet was damaged by American P-47 Thunderbolts and he was wounded during the forced landing. He was captured by American forces shortly afterward and spent nearly 2 years in custody, being interrogated about German aviation technology and tactics. After his release, Galland wrote extensively about his experiences. His memoirs, titled The First and the Last, became one of the most important primary sources for understanding the air war from the German perspective. His conclusion never changed, no matter how many times he was asked to reconsider it. The war in the air was won not by courage or individual skill alone. It was won by the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. It was won by the ability to train pilots in greater numbers and to higher standards. It was won by systems, not heroes. Individual excellence could not defeat systematic superiority. It never could. The mathematics would not allow it. Thank you for watching. If you found this story valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We focus on bringing you the forgotten stories and nuanced truths of World War II that deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? What other stories about the air war over Europe would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us continue this work.